Welcome to We Are Women, Unapologetically, the podcast that talks about the good, bad, ugly, and awesome. Careers, life transitions, confidence, and everything in between. Because shift happens, but you don't have to do it alone.
Let me ask you something. Have you ever looked around at your life and thought, I did it? I got what I wanted. I made the change. I did the hard part. And then you catch yourself doing the same things that you used to do. The pace hasn't changed. You are still pushing yourself when you no longer need to. You're not back to where you started, but the old ways that you learned to operate are still running in the background. That's what we're going to be talking about today because your life changes, but sometimes your default settings don't. And that's why your new chapter can feel strangely familiar. Welcome to We Are Women Unapologetically. My name is Jessica Cumming. Most of us have internal defaults that we don't even realize that we're using. They sound like, if I'm not doing something, I'm falling behind. If I don't respond fast enough, I'm not dependable. If I take a break, I'm being lazy. Or if I'm not needed, where in the heck do I fit in? These defaults didn't just come out of nowhere. They came from years of learning what got you rewarded, what got you praised, and what helped you keep your footing. For some people, it came from work. For others, it came from family. And for some, it came from being the one who held everything together simply because nobody else would. And here's why that matters. Neuroscience shows us something fascinating about how these patterns actually work. When we repeat certain behaviors in consistent contexts over and over, our brains create really strong pathways, especially in areas called the basal ganglia. Think of it like this. Your brain is wiring itself for efficiency. So every time you respond to a situation the same way, you are strengthening that specific pathway. And eventually what happens is those responses, they become automatic. They no longer require conscious thought. Research calls this automaticity. And here's the thing about it, is that these patterns are incredibly context dependent. They get triggered by cues in your environment, a certain time of day, a specific feeling, a familiar situation. So when you move into a new chapter of your life, but you are still surrounded by some of the same cues, your brain can default right back to those old patterns, even when they don't serve you anymore. But here's what I want you to understand about that is that these defaults, they're not who you are. They are what you learned. And what you learned can be updated. The research also backs this up because back in 2010, Dr. Philippa Lalian and her team at the University College London published a study in the European Journal of Social Psychology that looked at how long it actually takes to form a new habit. They ended up tracking 96 people for 12 weeks who were each trying to build one new behavior. The study found that on average, it took about 66 days for a new behavior to come automatic, though the range varied widely from anywhere from 18 to 254 days, depending on the person and the habit. But here's what's even more important about the timeline, is that the habits that actually stuck were what researchers called identity-based habits. When you actually start to see yourself differently, when you start to identify as someone who operates in a different way, that is when the change really starts to take hold. So if you've been operating on a default setting of I have to push through everything, and you're trying to actually build a life where rest isn't weakness, that shift requires more than just wanting to change. It requires you to start seeing yourself as someone who values rest. It requires you seeing yourself as someone who prioritizes your well-being, someone who knows that taking care of yourself is part of how you keep showing up. When that becomes part of how you see yourself, that is when the behavior follows. Here's what that looks like for me right now, because my calendar most days is full, and I mean full. Coaching clients, speaking engagement, applications and presentations, social media content creation, workshop planning and delivery, podcast writing, recording, editing, all of the things. I am the entire business. I'm the marketing department, sales department, customer care, finance, content producer, editor. You get the picture. But I chose this and I love what I do. But every once in a while, I take a day off. Sometimes my brain needs space. Sometimes I'm tired. I can honestly feel I am one more push through away from being completely useless the next day. Some of those days off, they feel like it's exactly what I need. Other days, I feel that familiar pull to fill that space with something productive. the urge to prove that I am doing enough starts to show up. And I don't overthink or fight it anymore like I used to. I notice it, I name it, I remind myself of what's true, and I keep going with my day off. Let me tell you what happened to me the middle of November through the first part of January. I was going full throttle, and to say that would be an understatement. I had traveled to Wisconsin for Thanksgiving. I came back to Texas, hosted a workshop, had a speaking engagement where the content just didn't feel right in my soul, and I scrapped it 6 times, not even finalizing my speech until the night before. By the way, I nailed that speech. But right after that, I was crocheting Christmas projects like a mad woman, starting them over because they didn't look exactly the way that I wanted them to. Luckily, I got them all out on time, but literally with no time to spare. I got back home on Christmas night only to turn around and leave 2 days later to fly out to Georgia. I ended up driving back from Georgia, spending one night in Louisiana and one night in Houston with my best friend from college, all before coming home to host a New Year's Eve party. Now, the truth is that I started feeling worn out even before Christmas actually got there, and I just kept going. The first few days of the new year, my body finally said, that's enough. Couple that with Texas allergies, and if you know anything about Texas allergies, you know that cedar fever does not play. Now, here's what I know about myself is that I always know when I'm starting to fight something like this, when I'm pushing through and I shouldn't be, because I reach for tea in the morning instead of coffee. The first Monday back after New Year's, I made myself tea. But I did not want to acknowledge what that actually meant. I thought, it's Monday, it's time to return to work, it's a new year. I have to get back to it. I wanted to respond to speaking requests, get a new podcast episode launched, social media content out for the week, all of the things. But physically, I felt horrible. I was congested, runny nose, overall lethargic. I worked for about an hour and a half, and finally I thought to myself, why am I putting myself through this? I walked out of my office, I looked at my boyfriend, and I said, I can't do this. I'm going back to bed. And that is exactly what I did. I slept on and off that entire day, sleeping more than I was awake. Tuesday was a similar day, although it was a day I had already planned on taking off. That particular Tuesday was the 13th anniversary of my mother's death. And every year, I made a commitment to myself that I would take that day off to honor her. I take that day off to reflect on the past year, to notice how I've seen her show up in my life, to think about what she's missed. I take that day to do things that she would have done or that we would have done together. And quite honestly, it's kind of how the day played out. I spent the day lounging in my pajamas, drinking tea, laying in bed, and watching things that she would have watched all in between naps. It was pleasant, it was peaceful, and it was absolutely what I needed. Wednesday, when I woke up, I felt better. Not 100% better, but better enough to know that I had rested enough to prevent myself from getting bronchitis. And I know this from experience because this has happened 3 or 4 times recently. I'm stubborn, if you don't know that about me. And in the past, I didn't want to think that I was getting sick until it was too late. There have been multiple times my doctor has said to me, why didn't you come in sooner? That tells you how long I put things off. But here's what made it worse, is that I had been a remote employee for so long that it had made it easier for me to work and then take breaks in between meetings. I would set an alarm to get up, accomplish what I needed to, still show up, still prove I could do it. And the reality is that if I had been in an office and didn't have an option to work remotely, I probably would have rested more. I say that because I wouldn't have had the convenience to log in and push through. I have always worked long hours remotely, but now that I own my own business and I have boundaries in place, that's what it's about. And that Monday decision to log off and go back to bed after just a few hours was me practicing those boundaries. And the truth is that old voice, it still shows up. That voice that says you're falling behind, you're not doing enough. I catch it, I recognize it for what it is, and I keep moving. Here's what I want you to understand about this is that it's about noticing it faster and choosing differently before you have spent an hour, a day, a week, even a year back in your own pattern. 3 years ago, I would have worked through that sickness until I ended up with bronchitis, lost 2 weeks of work instead of 2 days. That is progress. Catching yourself sooner and refusing to let that default setting make today harder than it needs to be. And the research on it is actually really helpful because scientists have found that we have two systems in our brains that are constantly competing. We have our habit system, which is all about efficiency, and it wants you to repeat well-practiced actions or similar feelings. Then there's a goal-directed system, which handles flexibility and planning and adaptability to new circumstances. When you are trying to change a pattern, you are asking your goal-oriented system to override your habit system. And that takes energy and awareness. But here's what makes it easier, though, is that studies on rest and cognitive function show that when we push through without adequate rest, we actually make it harder for our goal-directed system to do its job. Research published in multiple journals have found that sleep deprivation impairs attention, work memory, and decision-making. All of these are things that you need to interrupt an automatic pattern. So when you're exhausted and trying to make a different choice, you are fighting with one hand tied behind your back. Rest isn't just recovery, it is what makes intentional behavior change possible. When I chose to go back to bed that Monday, I was not just resting my body. I was giving my brain the resources that it needed in order to keep making different choices. That is the upgrade. Now I want to talk about you because you might be listening and you might be thinking, okay, that's great, but my situation is different. I promise you the pattern is the pattern. Here's where I see it show up all the time. You're at work, you're in a new role, but you still act like you have to earn your spot every single day. You answer your email at night so people don't think you're not committed. You over-prepare for meetings that don't require it. You do the most. You go beyond what's needed. And you do it because that is how you have always stayed safe. After a layoff, you finally have a moment to breathe, but you fill your time immediately. You apply to everything, you say yes to things you don't even want, and it's not because you're motivated, it is because space makes you feel behind. After a divorce, you don't want conflict, so you become agreeable. You keep the peace, you give more than you should. You don't actually ask for what you need because you don't want to feel too much. With empty nests, you don't know what to do with your extra space, so you fill it. You stay busy. You keep yourself needed. Different chapters, same default settings. And here's what matters most, though, is that just because this chapter changed does not mean that your brain automatically got the memo. You can be in a brand new situation and still responding with an old survival strategy. Think about that. The goal isn't to shame yourself for it. The goal is to catch it. The goal is to choose differently on purpose. Here is what I do now, and this is what I want you to try. When I catch an old default showing up, I ask myself 3 simple questions. Number 1, is it actually required, or am I just used to it? Number 2, if nobody judged me, what would I choose right now? Number 3, what do I want to practice in this chapter of my life? Now, sometimes the answer is keep going. Sometimes the answer is stop. Sometimes the answer is wait. Sometimes the answer is ask for help. But the big difference, I don't punish myself for having to make a choice. I turn it into, okay, noted, choosing differently right now, and I move on. I want to give you some real examples of how this has played out for me recently. I used to over-explain myself. If I made a decision, I felt like I had to justify it, give it 3 reasons, prove it was the right call, and now I simply don't. I state the facts and I move on. That's me practicing being direct instead of defensive. I used to downplay what I do. When someone asks me what I'm passionate about or what I do for work, I'd soften it, I'd make it vague. I would hide behind what used to be safe to say. Now, I own who I am. When someone asks me, I tell the truth. I am building a business around helping people navigate transitions and step into their power. I don't hide behind it. That's me practicing showing up fully. And I've gotten better at prioritizing what's truly important and putting aside what can be done the next day. Not everything is a level 1 hair on fire emergency. I am giving myself grace. And that is me practicing discernment instead of reactivity. None of these changes happened overnight, and they didn't happen because I suddenly became a different person. They happened because I started catching an old pattern faster and choosing a different response more consistently. Now, I want to give you some context of why this approach actually helps, because there's fascinating research on what's called the fresh start effect. You know how people get really motivated at the start of the new year or after a birthday or when they move into a new place? That is called the fresh start effect. But here's what research actually found is that those motivational surges, they can spark internal change, but they don't automatically weaken the old stimulus response associations. Your old habits are still there, they are still wired in, and still ready to be triggered. That's why people often revert back to old patterns after the initial excitement wears off. It's also why we have National Quitters Day in January. Studies on breaking habits show that you don't just need motivation. You need to actively weaken those old associations and build new ones. And the most effective way to do this is by catching yourself in the moment, choosing differently over and over in the actual context where the old habit used to show up. That is what makes it actually stick. Research also shows that rest plays a critical role in this process. A National Institute of Health study found that during rest, people's brains rapidly and repeatedly replay faster versions of the activity they had just practiced, and the more that they replayed the activity, the better they performed in subsequent practice sessions. Another systematic review and meta-analysis looking at micro breaks found that short rest breaks boost vigor and reduce fatigue. However, for highly demanding cognitive tasks, breaks longer than 10 minutes were needed to fully restore performance. So here's what I want you to do this week is I want you to pick one default setting you keep running. Just one. Think about exactly how it sounds in your head. Example, if I slow down, I'm going to fall behind. If I say no, I'm going to disappoint people. If I'm not needed, I don't know where I fit in. If I rest, I'm being irresponsible. Then think about a replacement that you can actually believe. Not a quote or a slogan, a sentence that feels real. I can take care of myself and still be serious about my goals. Saying no doesn't make me difficult. It makes me honest. My value doesn't depend on being constantly available. Taking care of myself is part of how I can keep showing up. Then practice it one time this week in a real situation. That is how patterns change, by interrupting them on purpose. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, okay, Jessica, this is helpful, but I need more than just this episode to work through this, I got you. I have 3 ways that I can support you depending on where you are and what you need. If you just need 10 minutes to get clear, check out the Clarity in 10 Reset. It's quick, it's focused, and it'll help you cut through the noise. If you need more than 10 minutes and you're ready to really dig deep into what's next for you, get on the waiting list for the Courage to Pause. It's where we go deeper into identifying your patterns and building the life that you actually want. And if you're thinking, I need to talk to somebody about this now, book a 30-minute call with me. We'll figure out exactly where you are and what your next steps could look like. All of those links are available in the show notes. If your new life still feels like your old one sometimes, it doesn't mean you made the wrong change. It just usually means that you brought old defaults into your new chapter. And the good news is that you can update them, just intentionally. And the fact that you're noticing it now means that you are already moving differently than you used to. Every time you catch yourself in an old pattern and choose differently, you are strengthening that new pathway in your brain. You are proving to yourself that you can operate in a different way. If this resonated with you, share it with a friend who needs to hear this. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And until next week, stay fierce, stay bold, but most importantly, stay unapologetically you.